The door creaked open by itself. No wind, no footsteps, no voice, just the confessional breathing. It was always like that in Ashridge, silence that felt inhabited, not just by memory, but by something older, something watching. Father Elias stood in the chapel alone that morning, just as he had done every day for the last 32 years. He'd grown used to the way the walls cracked in winter, how the wooden beams above him sang under pressure, how the stained glass caught the light, like it was trying to hold it hostage. But today, something was off. He couldn't explain why, but as soon as he stepped into the chapel, it felt like the building had been waiting, like it had inhaled. The air tasted different, dry, like parchment. He paused near the altar. The floor beneath him was colder than usual, and the candle flames swayed without wind. His eyes moved toward the confessional on the far left wall. It had been locked for 18 years, ever since Sister Therese disappeared. Elias never liked to talk about her, not to the congregation, not even to himself. There were things in this world, sacred things, that don't survive words. She was the last one to use that confessional. That night, 18 years ago, she stayed past midnight. A prisoner had come to confess, one who claimed to carry something unholy in his bloodline. What exactly was said behind that screen that no one ever knew, because by morning Sister Therese was gone. No signs of struggle, no broken locks, just silence, and one small bloodstain on the curtain inside the booth. For years people whispered that she ran away, that the pressure of the vows, the weight of confession, it was too much. But Elias never believed that. Therese was strong, brighter than most, and something about that night had always haunted him. The prisoner's eyes, the tremble in his voice, and what he said before entering the booth, "Forgiveness isn't what I came for. She won't leave whole." The man was taken back, into custody that night, and days later he hung himself in his cell. No note, just a smear of red on the wall in the shape of a cross. Since then, the confessional remained shut. Elias had locked it himself and placed an old cloth over it. It was no longer used, no longer mentioned, but the walls remembered. And today, that door was open. Father Elias felt his breath slow, not out of reverence, but fear. The kind of fear you don't run from because you know it's already inside you. Slowly he stepped forward. His shoes echoed in the emptiness, each footfall swallowed by the stone floor like the chapel was trying to erase the sound. As he reached the confessional, he noticed something strange. The dust pattern on the floor. It had been disturbed. A faint trail, like someone had walked barefoot from the inside of the booth toward the altar. But there were no footsteps coming, in only out. The curtain was no longer there. The cushion where the penitent would kneel had been turned slightly and tucked beneath it. A corner of paper. Elias hesitated. His hand trembled as he reached down and pulled it free. It was part of a journal, old, torn, written in red ink. The first line made his blood turn cold. This is not a confession. It's a warning. Something ancient had been whispered behind that veil, something that did not die when the prisoner did. And now, it had begun again. He hadn't slept properly in 17 years. Father Elias had stopped counting the days the moment he realized that sleep no longer brought peace, only echoes, and sometimes faces, mostly hers. Sister Therese appeared to him in ways he couldn't explain. Never full-bodied, never warm or alive, but shadows at the edge of prayer, whispers during Mass. Sometimes just the scent of rosewood and ash. The perfume she wore, the scent of the chapel that night. He tried to convince himself it was memory playing tricks. That trauma could grow limbs and dance behind your eyelids if you let it. But he knew better. In his bones he knew. What vanished in that confessional hadn't stayed buried. He sat now on the edge of his narrow bed, hands shaking as he held the torn journal page. It was real. The paper was old, yellowed, the ink faded but not forgotten. And the handwriting, he recognized it. It was hers, Therese. He had seen her pen that same red script dozens of times in the convent's lesson books, curved, deliberate, always with a slight slant to the right. But this page was different, rushed, almost frantic. The letters dipped and rose like a heartbeat breaking pace. This is not a confession, it's a warning. His mind wouldn't stop circling those words. A warning about what? About the prisoner? The thing he carried? Or about something deeper, something older? The room darkened as a cloud swallowed the weak winter sun outside. Elias looked up. A shadow had moved behind the stained glass window. No sound, no birds, no wind. Just the stillness of something waiting. He stood slowly, walking to his desk, where a candle burned low. The flickering flame reminded him of the last time he saw Therese, the night before her disappearance. She had come to his office with tears in her eyes and a question on her lips. Do you believe evil can kneel before God and still lie? He remembered how strange her voice sounded when she asked it. Not afraid, but hollow. As if something inside her had already started to crumble, as if she had heard something that had broken her sense of safety in this sacred place. He never answered her. He only offered silence. And that silence had cost him everything. Now, holding her words again after all these years, he felt it rise inside, guilt, sharp and invasive, like splinters of glass in his chest. He should have asked more questions. He should have checked the booth that night. He should have... But regret is a language God rarely speaks. And silence, he was learning, has a memory longer than sin. He lit another candle, sat and prayed, not for forgiveness, not for clarity, but for strength, because whatever this was, it wasn't over. A second page was tucked between the pages of his Bible. He hadn't placed it there, he was certain. I couldn't finish the confession. He said the veil wouldn't protect me, that some truths can't be heard without consequence. I felt something behind the screen, breathing, listening, smiling. He didn't come alone. His fingers trembled. It wasn't madness. It was real, and someone, or something, had been waiting 18 years for someone to look again. He stood slowly, turned to the small mirror on the wall. His reflection looked older than he remembered. But behind his tired eyes, something else flickered. Conviction. He would return to the confessional. He would not let silence win this time. And if whatever entered that booth still lingered, then it was time it was heard. If this feeling is familiar to you, if you've ever carried silence like a stone inside your chest, comment below, I felt it too. The door to the archive groaned as Elias forced it open. The scent hit him first, mold, wax, and the dry decay of forgotten paper. Dust floated in the beam of his flashlight like ash from an invisible fire. The stairs creaked beneath his weight, every step a protest from wood that hadn't been touched in over a decade. He hadn't come down here since they closed the convent wing. That was where the sisters had once lived, prayed and died, in silence, in faith, in obedience. It was here that they kept their records, personal effects, journals, liturgical robes, and relics. He reached the bottom and let the beams sweep across the room. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, stacks of hymnals and brittle cardboard. Boxes sagged from dampness. A broken wooden crucifix leaned against the far wall, its Christ figure chipped, its crown of thorns missing. In the far corner, he found the box marked Therese. It was smaller than he remembered, taped once, then again with red wax, the old seal the church used when something was deemed private under God. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside, a rosary blackened with age, beads cracked like bones. A photo, taken 2 weeks before she vanished. A worn, leather-bound journal with pressed flowers inside, and something he had never seen before, a cassette tape labeled only with a date. May 14th, 2007, the night of the confession. His pulse quickened. He inserted the tape into the old player on the side table, half expecting it to disintegrate. But the reel turned. And then a hiss. Then silence. Then her voice. If you're hearing this, it means I wasn't wrong. He froze. The voice was unsteady but calm, almost too calm. He came in with eyes like nothing I've ever seen, not just broken, but empty. I thought I could carry it, absorb it. That's what we're trained for. But this wasn't a confession. It was a ritual. A thump, some on the tape, muffled. He spoke in two voices. I asked him who else was there with him. He smiled, said, "The one you forgot." There was something else, something watching me through the screen, breathing slower than a man should. And I knew. I knew the veil was only cloth. The tape ended with the sound of a door creaking shut. He stood there for a long time. The quiet in the archive now felt invasive, like someone holding their breath in the dark, waiting for him to move first. He looked again at the photo. Therese stood among 3 other nuns, Sister Magdalena, Sister Ruth, and Sister Claire. All gone now, but not vanished. Sister Magdalena died in 2012, heart failure. Sister Ruth, transferred to a convent in Oregon, never spoke to Elias again. Sister Claire. He paused. Claire had disappeared from records. No obituary, no transfer papers, nothing. He picked up the journal, flipped through its final pages. Near the back, written lightly in red, "Claire won't speak of it. But she saw the thing in the booth, it looked like us." That line lingered in the room like breath on a mirror. Like us? Elias shut the journal. He turned off the tape player, but the room didn't feel silent anymore. There was something wrong with the air, heavy and wet, like something breathing right beside his neck. He looked toward the far wall where a crucifix used to hang. Now there was only the mark where it once was, and beneath that, freshly scratched into the stone, the veil tears from the inside. The sun had vanished behind a wall of slate grey. Clouds by the time Father Elias climbed the narrow stairs from the archive. The storm that had been threatening all morning had arrived, not with violence, but with stillness. A suffocating calm, the kind that precedes something ancient waking. He moved through the halls like a man walking backward into memory. The walls hadn't changed, but he had. Every step brought him closer to something he couldn't name. His fingers grazed the peeling plaster, traced the marks of time, of moisture, of neglect. The parish was a tomb of forgotten prayers, and tonight it felt like someone had started answering them. The church was empty, as always. No footsteps echoed except his own, and yet, with every movement, Elias felt less alone. The sound of the wind against the stained glass didn't match the rhythm of the air. It sounded intentional, like a breath against the window from the inside. He passed the nave, then the altar, then the confessional, still open, still waiting. But he didn't stop. He turned toward the hallway that led to the old east wing, the convent corridor that had been sealed after the sisters were moved and the disappearances began. The door had once been bolted shut, a symbol, they said, to protect the living from memories best left behind. But as Elias approached, the bolt was gone. The wood, warped with time, hung slightly ajar. A cold wind breathed through the opening, carrying with it the scent of lavender, candle wax, and old blood. His hand trembled as he pushed the door. Open! Darkness greeted him, not empty but full, like something waiting to be touched. He flicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the thick air, revealing dust suspended like ash. The walls of the corridor were lined with icons, but many had fallen. One remained, crooked on the wall, a painting of St. Lucy with her eyes in her hands. Elias's footsteps slowed. The floor creaked in a language he didn't understand. And then it stopped creaking. The floor ahead didn't make a sound when he stepped. He paused, shined the light downward. There, covered by a thin layer of dust and candle wax, was a hidden seam in the floorboards. A trapdoor. He knelt. No lock. Just a brass ring recessed into the wood, half rusted. He stared at it, felt his heart beating in his ears. It had the same insignia burned into the journal page, a circle split by a cross almost like a metronome. The same symbol the prisoner had tattooed on his wrist. With a slow breath, Elias pulled. The wood moaned, an agonized, reluctant scream. The air beneath rose like breath from the lungs of the building itself. He aimed his flashlight down, stone steps, damp, descending into silence. He hesitated, not because he was afraid of what he'd find, but because part of him already knew. He had walked this path before, not with his feet, but in dreams. And always in those dreams, someone was behind him, watching, waiting. He stepped down into the unknown. Each stone step was colder than the last. The smell grew thicker, Wet limestone, rotted linen, the unmistakable sharpness of incense that hadn't been burned in decades. It was like stepping into a place that was trying to be sacred, but had been abandoned mid-prayer. At the bottom, a small chamber, circular, stone walls, a single candle burned in the center, untouched, unlit, but warm to the touch, and on the far wall, another confessional. But this one wasn't wooden, it was stone, carved directly into the wall. No screen, no curtain, just a dark seat behind a heavy veil made of chainmail threads. Elias stepped closer. On the seat lay a single object, a veil, one worn by the nuns, bloodstained, torn, and inside the folds, a tooth, human. And the veil, sacred, torn, desecrated, had not been pulled away by hands, but by something that needed to see and to be seen. The confessional had no barrier, because the ritual was never about hiding. It was about witnessing. The veil had been waiting. The door had never been forgotten. The door had been waiting to be opened again. The chamber pressed inward like a clenched fist. Elias backed away from the stone confessional, heart racing, eyes locked on the blood-stained veil that lay draped, like a final breath. The human tooth inside its folds seemed to watch him, like it carried the memory of a scream that had never been allowed to leave the body. His flashlight flickered, not once, not twice, but in a rhythm, like breathing. Like something else was blinking back. He turned toward the stairs, but they were no longer visible. The darkness behind him had thickened, swallowed the path, the light, the air. There was no sound. And then, something whispered from behind. The veil. Too soft to be words, too loud to be silence. He didn't move. He couldn't. His feet were roots, his chest and a cathedral of thunder. Then the sound came again, this time behind him. No, above him. No, inside him. It wasn't a voice, but a presence. A weight pressing down on the bones of his memory, like fingers searching through drawers that weren't theirs. A flood of thoughts filled his mind, not his own. Images, disjointed, violent, sacred. Therese kneeling in the chapel, blood dripping onto marble, the prisoner smiling without lips, a hand feminine, trembling and reaching for a candle as if to beg the flame for protection. Then, the flame extinguished itself. Elias gasped and fell to one knee. The tooth rolled toward him as if nudged. He didn't touch it, but he heard it. A sound that had no place in the world of men. A giggle, not joyful, not childlike, but mocking, like a sound that had waited centuries to make itself heard. He forced himself to stand, but he was no longer alone. There was something in the room with him, not seen, not heard, but undeniably present. The air thickened as if inhaled by a massive lung. The candle in the center of the room flared suddenly, a single burst, before snuffing itself out. Elias's flashlight died, now only darkness, but even in the black something glowed. He turned toward the far wall, and there, drawn in the stone with what looked like ash and blood, was a new phrase, one that hadn't been there before. "You opened the booth, but not the door." He stumbled back. His breath came fast, his hands shaking. He tried to recite the Lord's Prayer, but the words tangled in his throat like thorns. The darkness was moving now, shifting like fabric underwater. Something brushed past his ear. He turned sharply. No one. But the presence grew stronger. It was not rage. It was not mercy, it was attention. And for the first time in years, Elias understood the truth not as knowledge, but as terror. Sister Therese had not vanished. She had crossed, not into death, but into something else. And now it wanted him to follow. Did you feel that? The breath on your neck. The thought that wasn't yours, right below. I felt the presence. He didn't remember walking back upstairs, didn't remember how the flashlight turned back on, or when the air lost its weight, or how the darkness allowed him to leave. He only knew that when he truly came back into his body, he was standing in front of the old prayer room on the second floor, the room that had been sealed off when the nuns left, the same room where Sister Therese used to lead evening reflections. where the prisoner had once been allowed to sit for solitary prayer before his confession. The handle was warm. He pushed the door. It opened without resistance. The room was untouched, frozen in time. Dust blanketed the pews, the altar, the floor, but the air was warm, thick like breath trapped in glass. And there, on the floor beneath the altar, was a box. Not hidden, not locked, just placed, like someone had known he'd come. He knelt before it and opened the lid. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, ancient, older than Therese, older than the convent. No title, no name, just a symbol burned into the cover. The same circle split by the cross. Elias opened it. The first page was blank, the second, blank. Then the third page bore words written in a delicate feminine hand. He confessed to a voice that was not mine. I was only the echo. He turned the page. They built the chapel on a broken mouth, and now it speaks again. We thought we were praying, but we were feeding it. He closed the book. The room pulsed. Somewhere deep in the foundation of the church, a sound echoed upward, like a bell underwater, a slow groaning tone that made his stomach turn and his spine shiver. He stood up too quickly, knocking the box over. The journal fell to the floor, opened to a page near the end. A pressed flower fluttered out, dried, almost fossilized. But beneath it, something written in red. It chose her because she listened. It chooses the one who listens longest. He heard movement behind him, turned. Nothing. Then, a breath against his right ear. You've listened well, Elias. He spun around. Empty room, empty air. But the veil that had once covered the prayer table now lay at his feet. He picked it up slowly. Inside, tucked like a relic, was a photograph. Old, discolored, but unmistakable. Sister Therese and Elias. Years ago, smiling, laughing, but behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the photo, a face. Not human, not demonic. Just wrong, as if something had blurred into the moment, something that had always been there. He dropped the veil, took a step back, and saw now what had always been waiting behind the fabric of faith. This wasn't a haunting. This was a residency. And Elias, he had never been alone in his silence. He was only now being acknowledged. If you were in their place, reading the journal, holding that veil, hearing that voice, and what would you have done? Comment below. We're listening. There were rooms in St. Dymphna's that no longer existed on paper, rooms whose keys had vanished, whose doors had been bricked over, whose names had been struck from the parish ledger. But Elias remembered. He had been a young seminarian when one of the older priests, Father Callahan, told him about the sacristy's hidden panel. A place for the unspeakable, he called it, where things go when they can't be buried, only sealed. And now, with the journal clutched in his hands, Elias felt that call again, not from memory, but from beneath the floorboards. He returned to the sacristy, stepped behind the old wardrobe and found the wall. Plain stone, but with a single seam and a hollow sound when tapped. He pried it open with a candle hook. A narrow passage revealed itself, stairs leading downward, carved into the foundation, older than the rest of the church. As he descended, the air thickened again, not with dust or rot this time, with expectation. The chamber was small, no more than 10 feet across. A single table, a single oil lamp, and one chair. On the wall, a painting, covered in linen. He approached it. Hands trembling, he pulled the cloth away. His breath caught. It was a portrait of Sister Therese, but not as he remembered her. Here she looked older, tired, eyes hollow, lips pressed shut, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Around her neck was the same rosary he found in the archive, and above her shoulder, barely visible, a figure shrouded in shadow. Not a man, not an angel, something in between. Elias turned back to the table. More journals, more entries, dozens of them, and in the center, a folder sealed with red wax. He broke it open. Inside was the original transcript of the prisoner's confession, written by hand by Therese. The church had hidden it. It began innocently enough. "I killed a man in 1983. He was not like others. He asked to die so it could escape him. Then I didn't come for absolution. I came because it told me to. And finally, you'll hear it too soon. When you do not answer. Do not reply, do not kneel. It only needs your agreement." Therese's final note added in red beneath the last line. It used the confession as a doorway. I let it speak through me. I agreed without knowing. I opened the booth, and I heard the voice behind the voice. Elias's knees buckled. She hadn't been taken. She had been entered. The booth hadn't consumed her. It had converted her, made her a vessel. The night she disappeared, she had already become a mouthpiece for something older than scripture, older than angels. She hadn't run. She had obeyed. And all these years, the whispers, the silence, the shadow behind the veil, they were her, and the thing inside her. He rose slowly, clutching the confession. There was no horror in his face now, only understanding. This was not about one nun, this was about inheritance. Whatever entered Therese had been passed down, not through blood, but through silence, through listening, through agreement. And now, Elias had heard the voice too. The sun had not yet risen, but the chapel was already bathed in a strange light. Not dawn, not fire, something in between. Father Elias stood at the altar, not to pray, not to preach, but to confess. He wore his cassock, the old one, the one from the night she disappeared. In his hands he carried the journal, the tooth, the veil, and the photo, offerings of memory, symbols of failure, and perhaps tools of release. The pews were empty as they had been for years, but the air was thick with attention. Something was listening. He approached the confessional, the real one, wooden, familiar, but changed. The booth no longer felt like a space between worlds. It was the world. He stepped inside and closed the door. He sat in silence for what felt like hours. The booth creaked with memory. Then a voice spoke from the other side. Not female, not male, not human. "You came to finish what she began." He didn't respond. He couldn't. "You carried her silence. Now speak." He clenched the journal tightly. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, to flee, to break the booth apart and light it on fire. But he stayed, because he remembered the words from the transcript. It only needs your agreement. And for the first time, Elias understood the power of refusal. He did not kneel. He did not confess. He only listened, just long enough to understand and choose. He took out the tooth, placed it gently in the ashtray inside the booth, took the veil, laid it across his lap, then whispered, not to the voice, but to her. "Therese, you were not lost. You were stolen." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a vial of holy water, one he had blessed himself before descending into the crypt. He unscrewed the cap, dripped it onto the tooth. The booth groaned. The veil began to smolder. The journal's ink ran like blood across its pages. And then silence shattered. The air collapsed in on itself. A scream without sound tore through the confessional. Not pain, not rage, but release. And then it was gone, truly gone. No presence, no pressure, just dust, smokes, and quiet. The kind of quiet that follows truth. Elias stepped out, and the sun, real, golden, honest, poured through the stained glass. He stood in its warmth for the first time in years. Tears ran down his cheeks, not of guilt, but of gratitude. The veil was gone. The voice silenced. And for the first time, he had not listened. He had chosen light. He walked to the altar, placed the burned journal on the table, and spoke aloud. Let the silence end here. Then he sat in the front pew and waited for the morning mass bell to ring, even if no one came. Because the chapel was no longer haunted, it was healed. If this story touched something deep in you, a memory, a silence, a weight you've carried alone, send this to someone who needs to hear it. They're listening, even if they don't know it yet. The bell never rang that morning, but somehow that felt right. There was no congregation, waiting, no choir rehearsing, no incense burning in the wings, just Elias, and the breath of sunlight through fractured glass. The chapel was still, but not empty. There was presence, not spectral, not demonic, but sacred. A holy silence, thick and weightless, the kind that doesn't ask for words, the kind that only arrives once the crying has ended, once the truth has been spoken aloud, and the soul has finally stopped clenching its fists. Father Elias sat alone in the first pew, back straight, eyes soft, hands resting on his lap, like an old man who had finally stopped running. Because, for the first time in 18 years, he wasn't listening for voices. He was listening for peace, and peace was answering. The journal rested on the altar, open to the page where her handwriting had bled. Its ink no longer ran. The lines had dried into something new, illegible, like language undone by grace. There were no more whispers from the walls, no breath on the back of his neck, no flickers in the candlelight, only the sound of birds outside, and that, he thought, was the loudest miracle of all. The world had started moving again, not because the darkness had been destroyed, but because it had been named. And names, real names, carry weight. Therese had never disappeared. She had never been erased. She had only been misheard. Beneath the veils, beneath the rituals, beneath the centuries of stained glass and sacred scripts, she had been crying out, not to haunt, not to possess, but to be understood. Elias looked up toward the crucifix at the head of the chapel. It no longer looked distant to him. For years he had stared at that carving with clenched teeth, angry at a God who allowed such absence. But now he saw something different. The Christ hanging there was no longer a figure of suffering. He was a witness to silence, to confusion, to unspeakable pain, and to the quiet courage of those who endure it. He stood slowly, walked to the side of the chapel where an old bulletin board still hung, covered in yellowed flyers, unused hymn, sheets and forgotten prayers. He took the photo, the one of him and Therese now burned at the edges, and pinned it in the center. No caption, no date, just presence. Then he lit a candle beneath it, a new flame, not to ward off shadows, but to welcome light. And as it flickered, a breeze moved through the chapel, soft, almost imperceptible. But Elias knew what it meant. She had been released, not banished, not punished, not feared, but heard. And hearing, after so many years of silence, was the most powerful prayer of all. He walked slowly toward the doors of the chapel, opened them wide, let the cold morning wind rush in, carrying with it the scent of pine, of soil, of life. Ashridge was waking. The town would remain quiet, yes. People would go on forgetting the old convent, the strange night of 2007, the sealed rooms beneath the floor. But the church had changed, and Elias would no longer fear the confessional, because the confessional had never been the enemy. It had only ever been a mirror, a place where truth, twisted or holy, waits to be acknowledged. He paused on the threshold. The light was stronger now, real and golden, illuminating every fracture in the stone. And he smiled, not because everything was okay, but because now it could be. Because the veil had lifted, because the echo had stopped, because the story had been told. And in the end, that's what saves us. Not the absence of darkness, but the presence of meaning. She disappeared into silence, but silence could not hold her. The morning wind moved differently now. It wasn't just air, it was a carrier of something unspoken, of something passed between those who had listened and those who would. Father Elias walked slowly down the old gravel path behind St. Dymphna's. The trees lining the edge of the church property stood tall, brittle from winter, but somehow no longer weighed down. For the first time in years, they no longer looked like mourners frozen in time. They looked like witnesses. The silence of the town hadn't lifted, not entirely, but it had shifted, from oppressive to sacred. Ashridge had always been the kind of place where people didn't talk about certain things, where secrets weren't buried out of malice, but out of reverence, out of fear that speaking them aloud would make them true. But what Elias had learned in the dark was this: silence doesn't protect, it preserves. And what it preserves grows teeth. The wind carried the sound of distant bells. Not church bells. None rang that morning. These were wind chimes from a porch nearby, barely audible, singing like a child humming to herself. Elias smiled at the sound. It reminded him of Sister, Claire's voice, one of the other nuns in that old photograph. Claire, who had vanished from the records but not from memory. He remembered now, clearly. She had left without warning, packed one night, disappeared before sunrise. But not because she was afraid, because she understood, because she had heard the voice too, and chose silence not as a prison, but as protection. The journal Therese left had been many things: a warning, a confession, a fracture in time. But it was also a bridge, a way of passing on a truth too heavy to carry alone. Elias reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the journal once more and began to tear the pages, not in anger, in offering. He left one page on the steps of the old grocery store, one beneath the statue of St. Michael near the cemetery, one tucked into the hollow of a willow tree behind the school. Not for fear, not to spread darkness, but to plant questions. Because the only way to defeat a voice that survives through obedience is to teach people how to question what they hear. By midday, the sun had broken through fully. The snow began to melt. Ashridge glistened. Children played again in the distance, laughter sharp and real. Dogs barked from porches. A shopkeeper swept the sidewalk outside his store, humming a hymn Elias hadn't heard in years. And in the bell tower of St. Dymphna's, the candle Elias had left at the altar was still burning, steady, bright, untouched by the draught. He would never tell the full story, not in a sermon, not in writing, not in the way people expected, because this wasn't a story for belief. It was a story for those who had felt the veil tighten, who had sat in the confessional of their own mind and heard a voice that wasn't quite theirs. It was a story for the quietly haunted, the ones who couldn't explain the presence, the ones who dreamed of corridors that didn't exist, the ones who carry rooms inside them with no windows and only one door. They would understand. They always do. And so, as Elias passed the edge of town, he whispered to no one and to everyone, "May your silence be holy, but never again be hostage." The town's library was nearly empty, as usual. Ashridge wasn't a place where people read for pleasure. Most came to check weather alerts, print out forms or hide from the cold. But that afternoon, as the last stretch of sun dipped low across the western hills, a girl sat alone in the far corner. Her name was Mara, 17, quiet, always quiet. Not because she didn't have something to say, but because she never felt heard. She often came here to escape, not from danger, but from the weight of unspoken things. She loved the libraries. Back wall, a crooked shelf of local history books covered in dust. The ones no one read, the ones filled with photos of people whose names had been forgotten, but whose eyes always seemed to follow her. Today, as she slid her fingers along the spines, one book fell without warning. She hadn't touched it. It landed spine up on the floor. Its title was faded. She opened it out of instinct, as if her hands already knew what they were reaching for. Inside, tucked between two pages about Ashridge's founding, was a slip of paper, not a page, a fragment, burned at the edges, written in red ink. The veil is not just between two people. It's between truth and the story we were told. She read it again. Then again. She looked around. No one. She folded the paper slowly, gently, slipped it into her coat. She didn't understand it. Not fully. But she felt something move in her chest, like someone had just whispered her name in a dream she hadn't had yet. And the moment she turned to walk away, the hallway lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. No big deal. Except Mara had always noticed patterns, and she could feel when something was more than coincidence. She looked back at the book still lying open. Inside the crease, written faintly in pencil, "Ask better questions." Meanwhile, Father Elias stood at the edge of town, beneath the crooked branches of the willow tree where he'd left another page. His work wasn't finished, but it was no longer his to carry alone. That was the strange thing about truth. You could pass it like a flame and never run out. Someone else would carry it now. Maybe Mara. Maybe someone who hadn't even been born yet. The veil had been pierced, and once light leaks through, it never leaves. Mara walks home that evening, the red note clutched tightly in her palm. She doesn't see the shadow pass behind the stained glass window of the chapel, but it sees her, and it waits. The paper wouldn't stop warming in her pocket. It had been hours since Mara found the note in the library. She hadn't shown it to anyone, hadn't spoken a word about it. But it pulsed against her skin like a second heartbeat. She thought maybe it was guilt, or curiosity, or the weight of words she didn't understand. But deep down, something told her the note wasn't just something she found. It had found her. She sat now at the edge of her bed, the town wrapped in silence outside her window. She held the note under her lamp, staring at the red ink until the words began to blur into shapes, circles, veils, something that looked like a mouth, open but silent. The more she stared, the more the silence in her room changed, not louder, just more intentional, like it was watching her back. She folded the paper again, slid it beneath her pillow, laid down without undressing, without brushing her hair, without saying goodnight to anyone, not even herself. She closed her eyes, and the dream began immediately. A chapel, empty, falling apart. Mara stood at the entrance barefoot, dressed in a robe too large for her. A figure waited at the altar, but it had no face, just a dark veil. She walked toward it. With each step, the floor beneath her changed. Wood, then stone, then flesh. She could feel it pulse beneath her toes. The figure pointed behind her. She turned. There was a mirror where the doors should have been, and in it she saw herself, but not as she was, older, weary, eyes red with sleeplessness, and behind her reflection, someone else. Sister Therese, mouth sewn shut, eyes wide open, tears of red running down her cheeks, and etched into the mirror slowly as if by invisible fingers, the same words from the paper, "Ask better questions." Mara woke up screaming, but no sound came out. Her mouth was open, her throat strained, but nothing, not a whisper, not a breath, just silence. She clutched her chest, heart racing, pulse wild. And then she noticed her window was open. She hadn't opened it. The cold air crept across her floor like breath. And on her desk, a second slip of paper. New, unfolded. No dust, no damage. Just two words, written in the same red ink. You listened. Mara didn't sleep again that night. She sat in silence back against the wall, knees to her chest, watching the window like it might blink. Something was happening, something that had waited, and she had stepped into it, not with a ritual, not with a prayer, but with attention. And now, it was paying attention back. Somewhere, in the hidden cracks of Ashridge, beneath old stone, and behind dry confessionals, something stirred. It did not rush, it did not chase, it simply turned its head toward the girl who listened. Mara hadn't spoken a word since she woke. Not at breakfast, not on the bus, not to the teacher calling her name for roll call. She wasn't ignoring them. She just couldn't. It wasn't fear. It was the knowing that if she opened her mouth, something else might speak first. The red note remained in her coat pocket. The second slip, the one that read "You listened," she had hidden inside the lining of her bag, afraid someone else might touch it. But deep down, she knew the paper wasn't the source. It was in her now, not a curse, not possession, more like echo. She excused herself during second period. The teacher didn't object. Mara had always been the quiet one, the good one. They didn't question her when she slipped away, which suited her fine, because she had questions. And they were growing, louder. The bathroom was empty, old, flickering fluorescent lights. A mirror that had once been cracked but had since been repaired with resin, except the crack remained visible beneath the surface. She locked the door behind her, approached the sink, looked up. Her reflection stared back, but something was wrong. It was delayed, a heartbeat too slow. She tilted her head left. It followed. Late. She blinked. It didn't. She leaned in. There, just behind her reflection, was the faint silhouette of a nun's veil. Not black, not white, something in between, ash-colored. Her own face began to change, not morph but shift, as if someone else's memory was trying to surface through her skin. Freckles she didn't have, a mole near the jawline, a faint scar across the brow. Therese. Mara blinked, and the mirror shattered. Not loudly, not with force. It fractured from the center, a perfect circle split by a clean vertical line, like a seal, like a symbol, like the mark from the journal. She staggered back. No alarm went off, no staff ran in, just silence. And from one of the cracks barely visible, a faint voice rose, not spoken aloud but inside her skull like a distant memory surfacing. You must choose what to carry and what to bury. Mara dropped to her knees, her head pounded. The lights flickered overhead, and for a moment the world went colorless. Everything drained when sound, light, even gravity. She found herself not in the bathroom anymore, but back in the chapel from the dream, the mirror, the figure. But this time Therese stood in front of her, mouth unsewn, eyes bright, voice clear. He carried silence like guilt. You must carry it like a key. You heard. Now you must decide. Mara tried to speak, to ask what she meant, but no sound came. Only a veil falling into her hands. Same fabric, same ash tone. This wasn't a haunting. It was a passing, a torch, a responsibility. And she hadn't chosen it by accident. She had chosen it the moment she refused to pretend she didn't feel it. Mara awoke lying on the cold bathroom tiles. The mirror was whole again. Her coat pocket was empty. Both notes, gone. But the imprint of red ink remained faintly on her palm. A circle, split by a line, not a scar. A seal. Something had opened inside her, and she was no longer afraid. The rain returned that afternoon. Not a storm, but a curtain. Thin, constant, cleansing. Mara walked the long road to St. Dymphona's alone, her coat soaked through, but her steps steady. Every sound, from the hiss of tires on wet asphalt to the whisper of water dripping from branches, felt like a voice trying to shape itself into language. The chapel stood like a memory carved in stone, old, familiar, and just slightly altered since the last time she'd seen it. The door was unlocked. She stepped inside. The smell of candle wax and damp hymnals greeted her. The altar still bore a single burning candle, the one Elias had lit, and above it the photo he had pinned remained untouched. Her eyes met Therese's in the photo, and suddenly she knew exactly where to go. She didn't knock on Elias's door, didn't need to. He opened it before she could reach it, as if he had been waiting. You saw her, didn't you? He said gently, not surprised. Mara nodded. She didn't speak with words. Elias looked down, then stepped aside. They rarely do. Inside his study, papers were everywhere. Handwritten notes, yellowed. Documents, old church registries with redacted lines. The same seal, the split circle, appeared over and over again, drawn in the margins, etched into corners, burned into envelopes. Mara approached the desk. In the center, a folder, labeled simply Therese. They told me she died quietly, Elias said, that she'd gone mad, that we should pray and forget. He handed Mara a page. Her hands trembled as she read. It was a letter, not from Therese, but from a superior at the diocese, dated 2008. The incident must remain internal. The confession was invalid. The seal remains intact. She was not the first. She won't be the last. Mara looked up. What is this? A cover-up? Elias sighed. No, not exactly. It's older than the church, older than names. The veil exists between what we see and what we feel, between doctrine and dread. He paused. But you already know that, don't you? She nodded slowly. It's inside me now. I can feel it watching through me. Silence. Then Elias said something that chilled her to the bone. Therese said that too, Mara stood, walked to the old confessional booth, near the back wall, ran her fingers along the curtain. It no longer frightened her, because fear, she'd learned, was what kept the cycle alive. Now she faced something worse, and holier: responsibility. "Why did you never speak out?" she asked. Elias didn't answer at first, then softly, "Because I thought silence was safer. But safety isn't always salvation." Mara turned. "I don't want to carry this alone." "Then don't," Elias replied. "Write it. Share it. Name it. Even if no one believes?" He looked at her with something between sorrow and reverence. "They don't have to believe to feel it." She left the church in silence, but with a new weight. Not a burden. A direction. She would gather everything, the notes, the drawings, the dreams, the reflections, and she would speak, not like a preacher, like a witness, because this wasn't a haunting, it was a pattern, a voice that survived by hiding, and she would become the one to bring it into the light. The rain hadn't stopped, but Mara had. Stopped hiding, stopped questioning her own sanity, stopped pretending that what happened in silence should remain there. She sat at her desk, typing. The room glowed dimly, her lamp flickering like an old chapel candle. On her laptop screen, a document titled, "The Voice Behind the Veil, a personal account of what no one dared to confess." No names, no exaggerations, just her truth. The scent of the church still lingered on the pages tucked beneath her keyboard. Incense, damp wood, faint traces of something metallic. Her fingertips trembled as she typed, but not from fear, from release. For hours the words poured out. The dream, the veil, the mirror, Therese, Elias, the choice. She wasn't writing to explain. She was writing to echo, to let someone else hear their own silence and finally recognize it. At 3:12 a.m. she pressed publish, an anonymous blog, no tags, no fanfare, just a quiet post in a quiet town, meant for the ears that were already listening. She expected nothing. Expected it to disappear into the internet's abyss, buried beneath noise, algorithms, and apathy. But something strange happened. Within 6 minutes, the first comment appeared. "I dreamed of a nun last night. I've never been to church." Then another. "I've seen the same symbol in my grandfather's Bible, circled with a line. I always thought it was a mistake." And another. "I've heard it too." Dozens, then hundreds, some anonymous, some rambling, some crystal clear. From nurses, from priests, from girls like her in small towns with empty churches and full dreams. It watched my daughter through the baby monitor. It whispered during communion. I thought it was God. Now I'm not sure. It never wanted faith. It wanted acknowledgement. Mara's chest tightened, not with fear, with recognition. It had never been just her, never just Elias or Therese or the prisoner. The veil was global, spiritual, symbiotic. It fed on one thing: isolation. And now that it had been named, written, shared, something in its form had changed. The next morning, Mara awoke with her laptop still on her chest. A new message blinked at the top of the screen, from a private sender. No name, no profile picture, just a message. "I buried mine in 1992. I'm ready to speak now." Attached, a photo of a stone confessional in the middle of a forest, covered in moss, sealed with wax. Her hand trembled. She recognized the symbol etched on the stone, the same circle, the same line, but this time, the circle was cracked. Mara closed the laptop, sat in silence, let the realization settle. Truth didn't destroy the veil. It pierced it, let light in, but it also let something out. At first, the comments felt like whispers, scattered, sparse. But within 48 hours, what Mara had released began to move like an invisible tide, steady, unstoppable. The anonymous post was mirrored across forums, spiritual blogs, hidden Reddit, threads, dark YouTube channels, and then The videos started. Footage of confessionals creaking open on their own in the middle of the night, recordings of double-voiced prayers during otherwise normal liturgies, accounts of children pretending to play church, slipping into trances and whispering Latin phrases they had never heard before. She talks to me when the house is quiet. The mirror showed me another mouth. The veil is inside me. The world was listening, and the presence, or its echo, began to shift shape. In Italy, a 72-year-old priest abandoned his parish, leaving behind one note. I heard her, I never answered. Still, she entered. In Colombia, a live Catholic radio station aired an old hymn. During the chorus, the choir's voice doubled, singing in an unknown language. The station received 214 calls in panic. The recording vanished within the hour. In Tokyo, a woman live-streamed herself removing a mirror from an abandoned temple. Her final words: "This is not God's house. It's the throat of something." Mimicking faith. She hasn't been seen since. And in Ashridge, everything looked the same, but not for Mara. She saw the symbol everywhere. Condensation on her window, scratched into the sidewalk outside her school, formed by fallen leaves at the church steps. It wasn't madness. It wasn't obsession. It was a summoning. The private messages flooded in, some in Latin, some with corrupted attachments, some completely blank, just a black screen with a single white pulsing dot, like an eye that hadn't yet taken form. And then the email came. Subject: St. Jude's Asylum, you're not alone. No text, just a single video file. She hesitated, then clicked. The screen flickered to reveal a dimly lit room, barred. Windows, crumbling walls, institutional green paint. A psychiatric ward. In the corner, a woman, seated, veiled in grey, motionless. Behind the camera, a hushed male voice. She's been like this since '91. Doesn't eat, doesn't blink. They say she's listening to someone we can't hear. Mara froze the video, enhanced the image, brightened the exposure. The woman's face was older, pale, hollow, but unmistakable. Therese, alive, not gone, held. The world had forgotten, but she hadn't. And now, neither could Mara. That night, Mara dreamed of standing at a stone pulpit. Thousands sat in silence, waiting. She opened her mouth to speak, but everyone already knew what she would say, because she wasn't the message, she was the mouth. When she woke, an envelope had been slid under her bedroom door. No return. Address. Inside, Ashridge was the first bell. You're about to ring the second. She dressed without a word, left the house, didn't tell anyone. There was only one destination on her mind: St. Jude's Asylum. Meanwhile, around the world, the reaction fractured. Some built prayer circles in silence. No priests, just candles and grey veils. Others fled churches, claiming the echo had taken the altar. A digital cult emerged in the deep web, the listeners. They didn't speak. They posted audio files labeled Velum meum auditum vivit silentium pactum. Each one was silent, each one terrifying. Mara's message hadn't inspired faith. It had awakened recognition, and recognition attracts, not followers, but eyes. And some eyes do not blink. She was no longer a witness. She was a fracture, a crack in the veil. And the more people looked through her, the more the other side looked back.